I'm Nan McKay. Welcome to Trailblazers Impact Podcast with inspiring stories of women who created new paths for other women to follow. Our website is trailblazersimpact.com, and you can contact us at hello@trailblazersimpact.com. Hello, I'm Nan McKay, and I would like to invite you to join Rae Meadows and I this morning. Rae, it certainly seems you've found your calling. You've written how many? Six? Is that right?
I'm currently at six. Yeah, I have five published, but I'm working on another.
Well, I'm reading all of them and I'm loving
That's
them.
amazing.
You've really won a lot of awards. I'm not even sure I know them all. I know that Calling Out received the 2008 Utah Book Award, and it was named an Entertainment Weekly must read, a Book Sense notable novel, a Barnes and Noble Discover Great Writers, New Writers selection, and one of the best books of 2006 by the Chicago Tribune. Wow.
I know it feels really nice to
Well,
get to
and
receive
as
that.
I understand it, Calling Out was even optioned by Sound Pictures, and you wrote a screenplay along with Alex Darrow.
Yes, yes.
That is
It was
pretty exciting to have your book made into a movie.
very exciting. It has not yet been made into a movie. I'm hoping at some point. But yeah, it's a very different medium too to think about. I mean, I'm kind of a visual writer, but so to think about it on film is pretty neat.
And to be able to envision, it what is what you see on the screen, what you have in your head, because you must have something in your head.
Yes, most definitely. And I usually the way that I think about writing is often very visual. Even in the arcs, I think of where I start and where I'm going, and I kind of envision the way that it comes out. So to think about it in a different way is really wonderful and exciting. And it took me a long time to figure out what my writing process is and how that works for me. But I believe I finally in my middle age figured that out. So that's great.
Well, you were also named one of five poets and writers, debut writers to watch. That's pretty exciting.
Very much.
And
Yes.
then you wrote your second novel, which was No One Tells Everything. And
Yes.
that was named a notable novel by poets and writers and was awarded honorable mention in the 2008 Ann Powers Fiction Prize.
Yes.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
It's wonderful. It's really nice. As a writer, I live a very. I mean, I have a family, but I'm kind of a solitary person, and I spend a lot of time in front of my computer working on writing, and so it's always delightful and surprising when someone reads actually reads the book, or I receive something for the book because I don't think in those terms.
Well, I certainly enjoyed it. Mercy Train is the one I'm in right now, and that was
Oh,
released in hardback as Mothers and Daughters. And I
yeah.
thought that was really interesting, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But that was chosen as a Target Emerging Authors selection. And it's been published in so many countries like Italy and Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands. And it was even a bestseller. That's tremendous.
Yes. Yes, it's wonderful. Yeah, it's wonderful. Also because I write. I know it's always a great bonus when that happens automatically.
Well, now you have I Will Send Rain, isn't that right? And you feel
Yes.
that was one of your better books? One of the
Yes, and
best?
maybe writers always think that their most recent is or their more recent is a better book, and I think that I have grown as a writer in the years, and even in my life experience, I think informs uh, what I write. And being a mother, all those things I think come into it, and for me, it was a I love doing the research for that book. It takes place in the 30s, and for me, looking at photographs and reading about that time period was really rewarding and fun as a writer to kind of delve into a different period than what I live in.
You and my daughter Molly were senior class officers together in high school, and
Indeed.
she was telling me that you had an AP English class with Mr. Mentis, who you both
Oh,
loved. Remember, he actually died while you were in school, didn't he?
he did. I was actually just relating that to my daughters because it was such a formative thing for me, to me, and he encouraged writing and he encouraged thinking, and to have him die when we were still in high school was a formative event, a very sad one, but he was such a meaningful person in my life.
Well, I think it's hard at that age because, at that age, I think you kind of feel nobody's really going to die.
I know it is very true, and even the way that kids think about time, I see it in my own kids. They don't have a conception of the future. It just is kind of like day to day to day, and so it that really brought that home a little bit for me.
We talked about this, but I would like you to tell our listeners how you came about to be a writer.
I like talking about this a lot, particularly to young women, because I feel like for me, I got very lucky in eventually finding the thing that is my thing. But I think as a young person, I was always an achiever and good at everything, but I didn't feel confident in knowing what I liked and why I liked it, or that I could pursue something and fail and take those risks. So I think it took me a long time, even in as an undergraduate in college, I didn't believe that I quite had what it takes to take a creative writing class. That felt scary to me, and I didn't feel like I necessarily would be good at it, so I didn't do it. And it took me until I was in my later 20s, after having a few jobs that weren't fulfilling to me, and not really understanding I really like to do in life. As I relate to you, I did have this moment where an old boyfriend said, out of the blue, if you could be anything, what would it be? And it really struck me at that moment. And I just answered a writer. And I had not thought about that consciously, but I think that in being a reader and enjoying literature and appreciating literature, I knew that really mattered to me on some level. And so I was ready to take that risk then in a way that I wasn't ready as a younger woman. I found it utterly life changing to take that first class and to realize that I actually could do this and work on it. And there was something, and I had a wonderful teacher who saw that in me as well and encouraged me to go back to school. I think from that point on, when I went to graduate school and then had my first story published, that was the pinnacle for me in feeling validation. And nothing since has felt quite like that, books, accolades, anything like that. But getting that first story published in a small literary journal was, to me, a signal that I had chosen the right thing for me.
And this
So
is where you
it's
should
been
be.
wonderful. Yeah.
Now, you've lived in many places, I noticed. Do
Yes.
you use those places in your stories or something similar? Like, on one of them, it was set in Wisconsin, and I know you lived in Minnesota, and then another
Yes.
in New York, and I thought, hmm.
Yes. I have really lived a lot of places. I was a little bit transient in my 20s, and I lived in Prague and Paris and Alaska, and I was all over the place. And I have found that I generally will write about a place after I have left it, which is kind of interesting. I think I have to think about that place and recreate it in my mind to make it something that I can write about, as opposed to living in the place and writing about it. And I don't know what that is. I think it's just some sort of device that I use as a fiction writer. So I wrote Calling Out, which is set in Salt Lake City after I had moved away from Salt Lake City. So I could kind of, it almost becomes then a real fictional, even though it's based on the real place, it has a real fictional quality to me, almost a mythical idea of what this place is. And I really have relied on the places I've lived in a way that I wouldn't have imagined. I mean, I love thinking about setting a story somewhere that I once lived in, or even I'm working on a novel now that is set in the 70s, but then the last part is set in the 90s. And even thinking about how life was different in the 90s before the internet was readily available and before we lived on our phones, it changes the way you think about drama, even, because you can't readily find answers to things like you can now with a quick push of a key.
That's true. In fact, have had several people tell me that it was so big in raising their kids because they would be coming home from work, and there was no way they could just get a cell phone and call their kids and tell them, I'm going to be a few minutes late picking you up, stay right there. There was no way you could get a hold of anybody. You had to use a payphone.
Yes, I know. And I remember even in high school, I would have to call my mom from the payphone to come pick me up from sports practice or, whatever it was. And it's a very different world. I will admit I'm slightly fearful of writing technology. To me, it doesn't feel as natural in human relationships to bring in the technology of today. But I'll maybe get over it and write about modern day one of these days.
I'm kind of guessing that you met your husband in New York. Is that right?
Well, I actually had met him briefly in San Francisco when I lived there. The boyfriend who asked me that pivotal question, and my current husband are very good friends. So I met him back then. But then, yes, when I moved to New York years later, we had been friends, and we met up then. And he's an English teacher, so we have certainly have the books and writing in common.
And why did you go on to Minnesota from there? Did you go to Minnesota from there or to Salt Lake from there?
We actually went to Madison, Wisconsin from there.
Okay.
We both felt it's very expensive to live in New York, and the pace sometimes is a little overwhelming. And I think we both wanted to take kind of a self-imposed sabbatical and go to the Midwest and live cheaply and write and kind of get some stuff done. And it was great. I absolutely love Madison. And then we moved down to Minneapolis, where my husband went back to work as a teacher. So I cherished those years, and the writing communities in both of those towns are so strong, and they have a real love of literature and writing. And I'm always appreciative to be kind of included still in that Midwest writing circle. And it was incredibly informative. And I think a lot of times there are a lot of writers in New York City and get a little stuck here. But I think that living in other places and experiencing the way that the rest of America lives is a great way to inform everything. Try to, have at least a better understanding of other communities outside of the East Coast.
Now, at one point, you even answered phones at an escort service. Did that inspire your first book?
Yes, it did. And I was a graduate student, and I needed one of my jobs was writing obituaries for the paper, and I needed another flexible job. And I honestly did not know when I answered the classified ad back when they were classified ads. I did not know that that's what it was for. It was very vague, and I just thought I didn't really know what it was, but I answered the ad anyway. And I had found the experience so bizarre and also heartening, and all these kind of a whole range of emotions of having worked there. And it did inspire my first book. I was very thankful that I took a lot of notes. I didn't take the job to write about it, but I did know once I started working there that it was something that I could not pass up, because this community, this kind of motley crew of people in Salt Lake City, of all places, was so particular. And I think as a writer, that's what we're always looking for, those very particular experiences. I wasn't exactly thankful when I had the job, but I was very thankful when I no longer had the job and could write about it. Much to my parents' chagrin, they knew they knew I was there, and I think they were glad when that phase was over.
So did you really have chance to talk to them about their stories?
I did, and that was the amazing thing about being in Utah in the late 90s, is that it still retained this element obviously the LDS Church is very strong there, and it still retained an element of almost innocence in a way that I don't think is like that anymore at all there. And you can't really find that in many places in America. But little agency that I worked for still tried to stay on the legal side of things, even though there was plenty of kind of unsavory things going on. But there was a certain innocence to the whole endeavor. And I grew to really care for some of the women, and they were very young, a lot younger than I was, many of them. And I felt a bit maternal towards them, and how scary it was to send them out to meet someone who knows what, what would happen in that moment. And it was something that really stuck with me. And I still find myself, I didn't keep in touch with anyone from that time, but I still find myself thinking about what happened to those 18-year-old girls, and whether this was a way station towards something better or towards something worse. And I think there was always that question. And a lot of it was economic, kids coming from circumstances that weren't ideal and didn't feel like they had a lot of choices. So it was a really, I found it quite moving in a lot of ways, also scary, and not what I would ever want for my daughters to be in, have that even experience that I did, but it was good for a writer.
Were most of them runaways, or did they look at this as a vocation for school, or what?
Yeah, it wasn't Runaways. There were some had, they all had families. So most of their families did not know what they were doing. And some were very confident and did not want to make minimum wage somewhere else. And they felt they could use this for a few years and make some money and move on. I don't think it's ever as simple as that. And certainly I'm sure for them, it wasn't that simple. But some of them, I think, would be okay. I mean, I do feel like some of them had a good sense of themselves. But it was quite interesting, and it was an interesting window into humanity, because really it came down, aside from the sex element, it was really about loneliness, and it was about loneliness that men were seeking some sort of alleviation of their loneliness, and a lot of times it was not sexual. It was looking for someone to talk to and to be with them. And it really was that. I mean, I had people calling me as someone who was just the person on the phone, but they would call me repeatedly because to them it was a conversation.
I notice you do occasionally weave a character into your book, like Sam was
Yes.
looking for, trying to follow the woman, to the motel and figure it out.
Yes.
In No One Tells Everything, your second book, I read this first, and the memories of the characters are haunting. You figure out that Charles is a sociopath when he kills the pet rabbit.
Yes.
And you want to call out to Grace, and you want to tell her, like, watch out. He really is who the police think he is. I know you don't believe it, but he is.
Yes.
And that means you're so drawn into the story when that happens.
Well, it's very flattering. Thank you. I started out that book writing a nonfiction book. There was a college student out on Long Island who killed another college student, and I became very interested in it in a way because it just nothing added up in the way that it was reported. And I exchanged a few letters with this kid in prison. But then at a certain point, to me, he was looking for something from me, and I didn't feel right about being someone who was going to tell the story and be honest about it. And that's not why he was revealing himself. So I switched. It was very kind of great, though, and very freeing to switch it to a fictional setting, and that allowed me to kind of think of it more in a narrative way as opposed to just recounting events of a crime. One of the things that I enjoy as a fiction writer is being able to embody someone who is not like me and be able to follow these things through that I would never do, but to kind of try to feel the empathy in there and try to find those moments of humanity, even in people who do bad things and who are morally questionable. So that book for me I think it's a very dark book, and I don't think I would write that book now since having children. I think it has changed. The way that I think about things has changed, and to me that just had some very dark stuff in it that I would probably not visit today.
Well, in the Kirkus review, they wrote, in her powerful writing, she creates memorable characters who are hard to shake off even after you've read the last page. And that was certainly true for me. And is that what you're aiming at?
Really nice. That's really nice. Yeah, I mean, I hope to, and I think of my writing as very character driven, and that's what interests me are the human elements and developing characters, as opposed to, there are all sorts of writers. Some are very much more into language and the beautiful sentence and working on that level. But to me, it's much more of a storytelling character thing. So I appreciate that, and that's what I hope, and that's what interests me. So that's what pushes me forward, is kind of having a character to work with.
Well, you did something in Mercy Train that I think must be really hard for most writers to do. You started fleshing out a character, and then you go to another character, and the reader is wondering, how do these tie together?
Yeah.
And then, even as a reader, you start figuring it out for yourself.
Yes. Well, I love that. And I will tell you about the Mercy Train. I wrote my in my initial draft. It's a story, as you know, of three generations of women. But I initially wrote three separate novellas, basically, and then one day I just cut them up with scissors and rearranged, and then went from there. And then I had to, kind of rewrite it in that way. But I found that kind of an interesting way to do it, because then I had these three separate arcs and then wove them together. And I like that juxtaposition of the different voices.
I thought it was very interesting. And I
So,
also noticed in Mercy Train that one of them was a potter. And I read someplace that you are a potter. How'd you get
I
involved in
am a
that
potter.
craft?
I am a potter. I have not actually done it this past year, but I have spent a lot of time doing pottery, and I enjoy it. To me, it's such a centering way to clear my mind, and I have enjoyed that over the years a lot in a different way. It's a different way of being creative than being a writer. And so, yes, you will find. I will say, in my first book, I did use a combination of people for the boyfriend character, but I usually don't use people that I know in books. But I do. There definitely are elements of my life that slip into all my work. But specifically that one, because I did live in Madison, and I was a potter, so that was very much based on me.
Why do you think women's stories need to be told?
I am such a firm believer. Even when I started reading, like being a really deep reader, I still maintained this element of, which is so ridiculous, but I think comes out of my own upbringing, that somehow women's stories were not as important as men's stories, and obviously that's a fallacy. And I think what's happened in literature and writing is oftentimes women who potentially intend to write about the domestic or more relationship elements, that has been relegated to not as important as the stories of men. And I think it is so important for women to own those stories and to fully believe that there is not a hierarchy of experience, and that motherhood and friendship and the domestic, those things are incredibly important and dramatic. And I think that to somehow cave to the patriarchy is something that it's tough, and it's something that I try to get my own daughters to understand at an early age, that there is a patriarchy, and that being confident in your voice, that it is just as important, and that it should be heard, is something that it took me a long time to get to, and I hope that they get to a lot earlier than that. I grew up in were older parents. They are now in their late 80s and very traditional. My dad is very conservative. I have two sisters, and he is a total sexist and has always been. And so it was. And my mom was amazing and is a wonderful woman, and an artist and all of these things. But I think from an early age, I understood that in their mind, that pretty and thin and these things mattered in a way that they don't matter, and I don't ever want to impose that upon my own children. And I think it's hard to break out of the things that you come to accept as a child. So I am a firm believer now in giving women voice all over the place. And I'm also a lover of women writing in a way that I wasn't for a long time, because I think I somehow still believe that the subject matter that women chose to write about was somehow not as important.
Interesting, because I almost always read women authors.
Yes, I
Very
do too.
rarely a man.
Now, yes, and I have come to also get angry about them. Some of the male writers that I used to really revere. because of all those issues and the elevation of the male voice.
Can you think back to what you might describe as one of the best moments of your life?
I think I have a few best moments. I think that one of the best times of my life was being in college. I think that I was a late bloomer and I got to college and all of a sudden doors opened both intellectually and socially and I started to understand myself in a way that I hadn't before that. So I think of that time period as being very formative. I also think having babies was, hands down the most amazing thing ever. And it has shaped me, of course, as any of us who are parents, it has shaped me in many ways. And it also has changed the way that I think about writing. I am an ambitious person. I was an ambitious person, but that has shifted a lot since becoming a parent. And I think more now about my time with my family and how they develop, and those things have definitely taken precedence over what I will achieve as a professional writer. I think those moments are huge. I'm trying to think of. There certainly have been others over the years where, in the one I mentioned, where I was asked what I would want to be, because that definitely shifted where I went as a human being and everything else. I think of myself, if I had not had that moment of figuring out that I wanted to be a writer, where I would be. And I think I would be potentially a not that happy person. Because as someone who has always achieved, I think I probably would have achieved in an arena that wasn't really my love. So I think it would have been fine, but not great. And I feel very fulfilled now in both my personal and professional life. I was lucky enough, the writing world has changed so much in the last 10 years. And I feel lucky that I got in with a book before that. And I have, my confidence has grown. I know that when I start a book, I know that I know how to make it work for me. And I know that I can get to the end of it. And I don't think I understood that before either. And I think that's having both experience and confidence and trusting that I have a vision that maybe not everyone agrees with, but that I have a vision of a story that can come to light.
I'm curious, a lot of people are publishing on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be a pretty easy and good way to get your work out there.
Yes.
How do you go about doing that? Do you just send in a manuscript, or how's it
They
work?
have, as far as I know, they have what they call, they give it a name. I think it's called Lake Union Publishing, but it just means published by Amazon. And I think one of their things is to kind of bypass the middleman a little bit. So I think an agent can send to Amazon. I think people just by themselves can send to Amazon. And I think they have a whole staff of people that can work on books. I mean, the publishing world that I am a part of is a pretty outdated system. It's a New York world where there are agents and editors, and there's a system of how things go, and it takes forever for a book to come out. And it continues to be this stodgy industry that hasn't quite kept up with the way, because now I think it used to be that self-publishing a book was just thought of as so beneath someone, but now it's gained a lot of people in the same way that Amazon, because it does give you a lot of control. You don't lose all the money to other people, and you have control over your work, which is often something that feels bad as a writer. With Mercy Train, that came out as Mothers and Daughters. Mothers and Daughters was not a title that I had chosen, and the publisher gave it that title, and I hated it, and I didn't like the cover. And those are things that you have no control over as an author. They don't really care your opinion. So I think to have control over that would be wonderful. I don't think me personally will ever go that route, only because I don't want to put in the effort that it requires to market your stuff and to put yourself out there, and to really work hard on that front, which I'm not great at to begin with. So I'll probably stay within the traditional framework, at least for now.
So did those publishers actually publish hard copies, and then who sent those into Amazon?
Oh, it's all through the publisher. Yeah.
Okay.
So and then they have these kind of channels of distribution. Though Amazon is really its own thing. So eventually, I mean, that is the worry from a lot of traditional publishers, is that Amazon will at some point eclipse those publishers and say we're only going to sell our own product. But I will say, in a very surprising but optimistic news, independent bookstores have actually rebounded in quite a wonderful way. So small independent, we saw the death of these big ones, and Barnes and Noble really struggles. But the small independent publishers have risen, and they are kind of reclaiming that community bond of having a bookstore in the neighborhood. And they actually are doing, after everyone kind of predicted the death of the bookstore, they're doing quite well. So I'm happy for that, since bookstores have always been one of my favorite places to go.
Kind of the cup of coffee and the book
Oh
go
yeah.
together.
Oh yeah. And it's funny. My husband and I, whenever we go to a new city, visiting or whatever, we always search out the independent bookstore, because for me that is the place where I can, feel. I love it. I love the whole feeling of it, and that would be a real shame to lose.
Have you ever been to Powell's bookstore in Portland?
I have, and in fact, that is where I saw your daughter last. I saw Molly. I went to Portland for I Will Send Rain. I gave a reading there, and it's fabulous. Just one of the greatest bookstores in America. And it was a thrill to have my name up on the Powell's marquee. That was great.
What is the hardest thing you've ever had to do?
You know what I would say in my life, one of my most challenging things, I have two daughters, one who is 11 and one is 8. And my 11-year-old, when she was born, she has had a lot of challenges, both health and otherwise. And I'm not sure ever prepared to have children anyway, but I was not prepared, I think, for the difficulties that came along with. She had a series of crazy food allergies, like anaphylactic food allergies to a whole range of things, asthma, sensory issues, and then she had this thing called selective mutism, so she did not speak. She only spoke to me or my husband until she was 5, when she started answering questions. But all those things led to a childhood of anxiety and doctors and therapists, and it was just that was life for a whole bunch of years. And I think for me, I still think that she's doing great. She's a great, super smart, great kid. But that period of feeling like I was always against the clock, that I could not make these changes happen, that things were, that has never left me. And I think that I think about that with her too. Those. So I think as a mother, that was probably the most challenging thing for me. And as things go, I think about things in my own life now that just don't even really pale in comparison to being worried about your child, which I think is incredibly hard.
Just thinking about all the things that you go through even still today, what advice would you give younger women today?
My advice, I mean, I don't know if I can say it succinctly, but I think that there are so many distractions now, always have been in different ways, but now certainly technological, and the speed in which people's opinion can be formed by images and by social media. And I think that there are good things about social media, but I also think it's can be a huge detriment and a huge waste of time. And I think that I don't want young women to be distracted. I think there's so much work to do in this country in every level, and whether it's political, whether it's reproductive rights, whether it's writing stories, whether, teaching, whatever it is, that I want no distraction. I want confidence. I want girls to know that they are valid in their choices, whether it's to be a scientist or whatever it is. I think that we face, and young women still face, a real uphill battle in getting to a point of feeling like they're not an imposter in whatever they are doing. And I see it. I taught a class recently, which I loved, to a group of young people who had gotten their GEDs, and they'd all had various challenges. Some had been in jail, some had kids as teenagers, and I found it really profound that they were taking this class, that they had read my book, that they had wonderful insights into it. And the women there came up to me. They were the ones that came up to me after and wanted to have, give me book recommendations, or, they were eager and ready. And I want that for women. And I want them to not face those implicit roadblocks that we have all faced, and that are still out there. It takes a lot more work sometimes, but I am a firm believer and hoping that without getting distracted by all the things there are to be distracted by, that women can feel completely validated in their choices of how they choose to, for their own lives, and also just this generation coming forward, and how they can reshape social issues as well. So that's a very convoluted way to say that I really hope that they start out with a belief in themselves that it took me a long time to get.
Well, Rae, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. You're certainly on an upward trajectory and doing marvelous things, and pretty much doing what it seems like you really were meant to do and like to do in life. And not
I
very
think
many
that,
people can say that. So that's
yeah,
tremendous. And I am really thankful that you're giving back to women today as well, even in your busy life. And I do feel that's very important. So thank you so much.
thank you so much, Nan. It was a delight, and I love that you're doing this podcast, because you're doing exactly what that getting that word out in the same way and celebrating women.
I hope you enjoyed listening to another story of the impact of trailblazers. Visit our website at trailblazersimpact.com and connect with us at hello@trailblazersimpact.com. And remember, you must learn a new way to think before you can master a new way to be.